All right, it's 11, so we're going to get started. Hope everybody's having a good week. There we go. Okay. So today we're going to talk about photosynthesis and respiration. I'm going to go over some of the stuff we're working on as well, see if you guys have any questions on those things. Yeah, all right. So today's schedule, we're going to talk about greenhouse gases, photosynthesis, respiration. There's also a slide on ocean acidification. It's kind of a wide group of things today. I'll talk a little bit about ecosphere and INAT if you guys have any questions on those. And then important announcement here, we've got our first exam next week on Thursday. That's going to cover concepts about the ecosphere as well as topics from these first 3 lectures. So that was the scientific method and experimental design, biomolecules and pH, and then today, photosynthesis and respiration. For the exam, this is the one time that attendance is mandatory in class. So you have to be there at 11 a.m. with your cameras on. I'm not going to do a lockdown browser, at least for this one. So don't worry about that. It is open note. So if I were you guys, I would download the PowerPoints ahead of time and just have them open because all the questions are going to be pulled directly from these slides, except for maybe some ecosphere questions that I might pull out of the lab manual. Yeah, it's going to be 30 minutes, somewhere between 15 and 25 questions. And that will be on Canvas under the quizzes. So there'll be an exam on there. It says quiz, but it's an exam. We'll just open that up, everybody will get started. And then after we take the test, we'll have a little lecture, I believe, and that'll be it for class next week. Does anybody have any questions on the exam? About the exam. Right. Actually, before we move on, we'll talk now about ecosphere and INAT stuff. So remember, your first set of INAT observations are due tonight by midnight. I looked through a few of yours. Mostly they look pretty good, those of you who've already submitted. One thing I wanted to note is, and I might not have made this clear, so that could be on me, but these pictures need to be identified, and the program does that itself if your picture is close enough to the organism. So I had some submissions that looked like they were just a picture of general wildlife and they were categorized as unknown. That does not count. You've got to find a specific organism and it needs to be identified at the very least to like the family of birds or something along those lines. If you can get it down to species, that would be awesome. But you can't just leave it as unknown. Those have to be identified. Ecosphere stuff, remember that's due next Thursday. So you're going to have your initial observations in, as well as a selfie with your finished ecosphere, so that I know you're the one who made it, and a few pictures of the setup itself, and those could be pictures of the site you collected from, pictures of all of your materials laid out on the table, kind of whatever you're feeling there. I just want to see a few pictures of the process of you actually building it. And then obviously either the screenshot or Word document of your observations. I actually just got an email from somebody in my other class. I don't want to make this clear. There's a couple things in there for like pH and weight. So some things I know are not going to be able to be measured by everybody. If you have the materials to measure those things, by all means, go ahead and do it. But if you don't have pH strips and can't measure pH, like I'm not going to take off points for that. That's totally fine. Just write in NA and that'll be totally cool. But most of it you should be able to complete. And yeah, any questions on ecosphere or INAT? Cool. If that's it, we can go on to lecture. All right. Greenhouse gases. So our atmosphere is made up of a whole different bunch of gases, and the real big ones are constant. These don't really change at all. They may have really minor fluctuations, but ultimately these proportions stay the same. So our atmosphere is about 78% nitrogen, 21% oxygen, and 1% argon. These gases don't affect climate and weather. They're very neutral. They just kind of float around up there. Don't really have any impact on our environment other than oxygen being a resource for respiration. Then you have a bunch of variable gases. So these make up the final portion of our atmosphere, and these are all greenhouse gases. And all a greenhouse gas is a gas that has the ability to absorb infrared radiation. So the most prominent greenhouse gas in our atmosphere is water vapor. It comprises about 0 to 4%, which I know seems like a pretty big range, but it just depends on the area you live in. The next biggest greenhouse gas is carbon dioxide, which obviously you hear about all the time with climate change. That makes about 0.0038% of the atmosphere. Beyond that, you're starting to get really small proportions, but you have things like methane, ozone, and just an assortment of other gases. So each of these does have a variable effect on the amount of infrared radiation they can absorb. For example, methane is about 26 times more potent than carbon dioxide. You just don't hear about it as much because there are really just trace amounts of it in the atmosphere. Carbon dioxide, while less effective on the individual molecular level, is just so much more voluminous in the atmosphere that is really what we focus on when thinking of climate change. So along the lines of carbon dioxide, this can be removed from the atmosphere by plants and the ocean, and that's a little kind of misleading because it's mostly plants in the ocean that pull it from the atmosphere. There's also some new techniques and technologies being developed that extract carbon dioxide. Some of these are referred to as bioremediation. Some neat stuff going on. So those are greenhouse gases. We can look at them across a few different planets and kind of see the effect they have. Obviously, we live on Earth. We're the third planet from the sun. And probably the biggest difference between these two planets is that we have liquid water. And this is largely due to our average surface temperature of 58.6 degrees, which is kept that way due to the amount of greenhouse gases in our atmosphere. If you look at a planet like Venus, they have a completely different situation going on. So they're the second planet from the sun, but they are experiencing something that we refer to as the runaway greenhouse effect. And what this essentially means is they have such a high volume of methane and carbon. Thanks. Sorry guys, it looks like I'm back to having internet problems. Yeah, again, I don't know what's going on in my house, guys. I'm sorry. It should be fixed. Where were we? All right, so runaway greenhouse gas. They have so much volume in the atmosphere that any kind of heat generated on the planet or captured by the planet can't escape. So it basically just turns into this huge oven. So they have an average surface temperature of 900 degrees Fahrenheit, which is crazy. We sent a probe there in, I think, the 80s, maybe the 90s, and it basically dissolved in like 5 minutes. We got a couple pictures before it was destroyed, but it's super hot there, and that is because of all the greenhouse gases trapped on the planet. In contrast, you look at a planet like Mars that doesn't have an atmosphere. They have no greenhouse gases there. And you get an average surface temperature of negative 80 degrees Fahrenheit and no liquid water. So obviously greenhouse gases play a super important role in the nature and climate of a planet, as well as the possibility of any kind of life forming or water. So super relevant. We'll talk a little bit about ocean acidification now. This is my jam. I'm researching ocean acidification here. And it's often referred to as the other CO2 problem. So classically, everybody's heard of global warming, that's the atmosphere's temperature rising. But then a more recently realized problem was that the ocean is becoming more acidified because of this massive uptake of carbon dioxide. So like I kind of previously said, the ocean is a major sink for CO2, which at first sounds like a good thing, right? Because the ocean's sucking in all this carbon dioxide, it's reducing the impact of global warming in the atmosphere. But it is affecting marine environments. So when CO2 is absorbed into the ocean, it goes through this chemical process here where it combines with water and creates carbonic acid. And then carbonic acid delineates more into bicarbonate ions and hydrogen ions. So if you remember from our pH lecture, that measures the concentration of hydrogen ions in a liquid. So we're getting this increase in hydrogen ions in the ocean, and it is slowly making it more acidic. The ocean currently is at about a pH of 8.1. The International Panel on Climate Change has projected that to drop to about 7.5 by the end of the century. And I know that doesn't sound like a huge change. No, it doesn't even technically get to neutral at that point. But if you remember, pH is a logarithmic scale, so that small change in numbers is actually a huge impact on this environment. And that has a number of effects on marine organisms. People have probably heard of coral bleaching. That's, I think, the most prominent one. I've seen pictures of the Great Barrier Reef recently. All the corals have turned white. And that's because the color on corals is actually from a symbiotic organism called zooxanthellae, and the increased acidity has caused the zooxanthellae to leave the coral. So all you're seeing is the coral's calcified skeleton, basically. Additionally, calcifying organisms, so this is another problem for coral, but they form their skeletons, and these are things like mussels, crabs, any kind of shellfish in the ocean forms their skeleton, external skeleton, from carbonate ions that are floating around in the ocean. And this acidifying process is reducing the amount of carbonate ions, so they don't have the materials they need to build their shells as strong. And that kind of causes a two-part problem because they can't build their shells as strong, and then the ocean's more acidified, which dissolves their shells. So it's really this nasty positive feedback cycle. And things are just kind of slowly melting in the ocean, which is really unpleasant for them. And then there's a bunch of other smaller effects. Like what I'm researching is the ability of animals to detect sensory cues due to changing acidified things. And there's a plethora of small things like that that are going on, but the big ones are calcifying and things like coral bleaching. We'll shift gears a little bit to photosynthesis. I know this kind of is a hodgepodgey lecture, but it all just bases around there is gas in the atmosphere. So photosynthesis, this occurs in plants. I'm sure everybody here has heard that it takes place in chloroplasts, and it does have two different reactions. The primary one is the light reaction, which occurs during the day. And then there's also something called the Calvin cycle, which can happen at night. It does not require light for that reaction. The end goal of both of these cycles is to create glucose for energy. And plants are super important to us. Obviously, oxygen is a byproduct, and they obviously produce glucose, so we get a lot of our energy from plants. Here is the chemical equation for photosynthesis. It's fairly simple. 6 molecules of carbon dioxide plus 6 molecules of water plus light creates a single molecule of glucose and 6 molecules of oxygen. And that is essentially all that photosynthesis really is these elements combining and creating sugars. There will probably be a question on this picture, so I would study this. You don't need to worry about NADPH involved here. We're just going to focus on light. So what is ATP? So this is what is created from the glucose in photosynthesis, basically. Glucose gets used for respiration in plants, and it eventually creates ATP. And this happens through glycolysis, which is simply the breakdown of glucose into 2 pyruvate molecules. And you don't need to know what pyruvate molecules are, just that it breaks them into 2 of them. And this reaction creates energy in the form of ATP. And this is used in cells basically to do any kind of cellular mechanisms and procedures they have to do. Glycolysis can occur with or without oxygen. So there are 2 different processes there, and I'll talk about those briefly. And it takes place in the mitochondria in these cells. So aerobic respiration. This is when glycolysis occurs in the presence of oxygen. and it converts glucose into water, carbon dioxide, and ATP. So here's the chemical equation for that. As you can see, we're starting with the glucose molecule that we got from photosynthesis, and it breaks down into water, carbon dioxide, and 36 ATP. So that is an important number because in aerobic respiration, this whole process is incredibly efficient. You get 36 ATP from a single glucose molecule. And this is going to differ pretty dramatically from anaerobic respiration. So anaerobic respiration is just glycolysis without oxygen. Not to be confused with fermentation. This is a separate process. I'm sure everybody's heard of fermentation in relevance to things like beer and wine, any kind of alcohol, and that's because certain microorganisms, when they go through anaerobic respiration, create a byproduct of ethanol, and that is the whole process of brewing alcohol and things like that. Our animal cells also go through fermentation though, and we create lactic acid as a byproduct of anaerobic respiration. And this primarily happens in your muscles. So if there's any athletes or anybody who works out a lot here, you've probably heard of lactic acid. This develops and builds up in your muscles when you're under a lot of muscles are under a lot of intense stress. So basically what's happening is your body requires more energy than normal. So it starts going through aerobic and anaerobic respiration at the exact same time to produce enough ATP to carry on, but you're producing so much of it that you get this buildup of lactic acid in your body that can't be broken down as quickly as it's developing. So here's the big difference between anaerobic and aerobic is that we produce only 2 ATP as opposed to the aerobic process, which produced 36. So they're each still starting with that single glucose molecule, but when they break it down without the presence of oxygen, you get far less energy from it. But it still can be useful. Obviously, a lot of organisms live in places that don't even have oxygen, so they go through anaerobic respiration. Some organisms like us use it just to generate extra energy when we need it. So it is important, but it is not as powerful as aerobic respiration. And the whole fermentation thing is going to tie into our sourdough project, which I'll talk more on next week. The slides are in this lecture, but I think that's next. Yeah, so we're going to do sourdoughs. You don't need to do anything for this now. I would say if you can, sometime before the next class, start looking at that lab in your lab manual, and you can start to gather some of the materials. And then next week, I'll introduce this as an actual project. So you'll see these slides again. But I'm going to leave these on here when I post the lecture slides. So if you want, you can obviously poke through and read these. That would actually be great. Cool. So that's it for that lecture. Our homework, remember you have your first 5 INAT observations due by midnight tonight. You have your initial observations and pictures of your ecosphere due next Thursday. Exam 1 also next Thursday. Open note, be in class at 11 a.m. Must be in class with camera on. Oh yeah, second set of INAT observations, also due next Thursday. I know this seems like a lot. It's really not too bad. A lot of you who've submitted already had like 10 pictures, so you're ahead of the curve on INAT. But yeah, next 5 due next week. Someone's saying something in the chat. What do we got? How many INAT observations do we need to have for the semester? It's going to be about 50. These first 2, I'm having you do 5 at a time, but I think the next, so your third set of INAT is going to be 10 additional pictures. So I'll double check, but there will be some gaps. And I'll just kind of be assigning those when we have the time for them. But again, if you're out taking pictures, just go ahead and take a bunch. So you should have 10 by next week. If you've got more than that, totally good. Should we have bought the lab manual by? Yeah, you should have bought the lab manual in the first week. That should have been done a long time ago. I thought I was pretty clear on that. Because you can't, you need to order the algae beads, and you can't order the algae beads without the lab manual. So as soon as you get it, that should be the first thing you do is order the algae beads. Another important thing while talking about that is this code that comes in your lab manual. It is not the same for everybody. Everybody has your own code. If you borrow your friends, they're not going to be able to buy their algae beads. So please order the lab manual so you have your own personal code to order those. All right, any other questions on any of those projects or on our exam? I will not be at office hours today. I'm actually going to adopt a dog. So just let you know I won't be there. Feel free to email me if you have any questions. But if that's it,